Hello, thank you for listening to A Glimpse of the Kingdom. I am David Pendergrass. There are two podcasts, two interviews you might call them. They turned into a podcast on a British Christian radio program called Unbelievable, led by Justin Brierley. And it's a great program. I really encourage you to listen to his program, Unbelievable. You can find a lot of his radio interviews on YouTube, but also, of course, he has a podcast. The podcast is worth downloading and listening to. It's free, Unbelievable, at Premier Radio. And Justin Brierley does a great job. Usually, it is a conversation and or debate between two different views of something, whether it be atheism versus Christianity, Judaism versus Christianity, Calvinism versus non-Calvinism, gay versus straight, whatever. There's all kinds of things, but it's usually done in a very good, kind manner. So they're more like discussion. They're not yelling at each other and cussing and screaming. I mean, sometimes people lose their temper a little bit, but in general, it's usually very, very civil. And I like that because it's good to have good civil discussions. And Justin does a great job hosting. And so I encourage you to listen to his podcast and YouTube, whatever, how you want to get there. Unbelievable. Well, there are two, I call them podcasts because that's how I first listened to them. I don't listen to the British radio station. Two podcasts where he interviews Richard Bauckham and Bart, as he says, Bart Ehrman. He says it so great in British. Bart Ehrman is American. The interview process is good. Their debate is good. When I listened to it, I enjoyed it a lot. And I thought, a lot of these terms and the people they reference, I bet a lot of people don't know who they are because I would not have a clue who they are if I didn't have my education in the field. And so I thought it might be helpful just to give a little commentary. So what I want to do is, not to disrespect his wonderful podcast, you ought to listen to it, but I'm going to clip out the parts where the two scholars speak and pause it every once in a while and reflect on what they've just said and hopefully maybe explain a little bit more of what's going on. Hopefully that's going to be a good resource for you to think about these things because they assume things when they talk. So let's start there. Richard Bauckham was a professor for many, many years. He's a British scholar. His background is in classics. So he came to the New Testament game a little bit older, later in his educational career. And he was, until 2007, one of the professors of New Testament studies at the University of St. Andrews. Bauckham is grade A British scholarship. British scholars in biblical studies and theology tend to be more middle of the road, you might say. Personally, I find them much more compelling typically, where German scholars typically are much more, I don't like all these labels, but it is true, it's a standard in scholarship. They're a little more to the far left, British a little more toward the middle, Americans kind of all over the place. But I like the British because they typically are very even-handed and level-headed and so forth, typically. Anyway, I like Bauckham. Baukham's a well-respected scholar. Well, a few years ago, he came out with a book called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. And it was a great book. And some people, of course, don't find it compelling at all, and some find it very compelling. This might sound odd to you, but in scholarship, almost all scholars for a long, long, long time don't believe that the Gospels we have are always very historically reliable. That's a mouthful, but they're not very historically reliable, and that they certainly don't go back to eyewitnesses. They're generations removed from the original people and so forth. American and British scholars of the last few decades have been changing the tide of that view for various reasons. And Richard Baukham's book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, argues in a nutshell that behind many, many, many of the stories in the Gospels are actual eyewitness accounts. And he sometimes just says, let's suppose that. And if it were an eyewitness testimony, what would it need to have in it? And then he shows how those things are in it. Well, it's I think, a fantastic book, well argued. It's not light reading. It is a technical, scholarly work, but he, I think, makes a very compelling case that in large part, a big significant portion of the Gospels go back to eyewitness accounts. Like in Mark 9, the Bartimaeus who gets healed, he would suggest that actually goes back to the Bartimaeus himself, who recounts the story. And if you assume that, several features in the story make sense if it did come from Bartimaeus. And some other stories make sense if they didn't come from the person who was healed, but the person who was there in the room, things like that. Any case, Bart Ehrman is an American scholar. Now, he teaches in North Carolina, and he's written a numerous amount of books. Bart Ehrman, of course, who, I shouldn't say of course, but it is kind of course. I think you'd agree with this. He writes the books that he wants to get to the popular level of people and, of course, make him some good money. And he has now written kind of a counter book to Richard Bauckham's book. And his counter book talks about how you can't trust memory, you can't trust the oral eyewitness testimony, even if it is eyewitness testimony and so forth. So these are the two perfect people to have on this subject today that is on Unbelievable Podcast, because they're discussing basically this issue. Can we trust the Gospels as we have them to be historically reliable if they are or are not based on eyewitness accounts? That is, how trustworthy is the original background? Now, I'm not going to say much more about that right now because we will as time goes on. But right now, I'm trying to introduce you to Richard Bauckham, who's a British scholar. Bart Ehrman is an American scholar, and their views are almost diametrically opposed. So here we go. So I'm going to play segments of the two podcasts. I do encourage you to go listen to both of them yourself. And I'm deliberately not I'm not rearranging the material. I'm just cutting out Justin Brierley, the host. I'm cutting out all of his host comments, and I'm cutting out the commercials, and I'm cutting out some of the stuttering and whatever. I'm just trying to get right to the meat and potatoes of their arguments and explain that. But I do encourage you to go listen to the actual podcast if you want to hear every single word that was said. Here we go.
I think form criticism is extraordinarily important because it's really the reason why the majority of gospel scholars take it for granted that the Gospels are the product of a long process of oral tradition. People didn't think that before the form critics. It's the form critics' idea. And they had specific reasons for thinking that, which come out of their notion of the forms. What most people who know anything about form criticism know is that the form critics classified the stories in the Gospels as miracle stories, controversy stories, healing miracles, so forth, various types of story about Jesus or saying of Jesus, like parables. But the key thing, and really any of us could do that, it doesn't take a whole cohort of great scholars to tell us that. What was important about the form critics is what they did with those forms and how they thought they arose. And they thought they could tell from the state of those forms that we have in the Gospels that the Gospel material had evolved over a long period of tradition. And perhaps two reasons they thought that. One was they thought that a particular form, such as a miracle story, could be correlated with a particular use to which it would be put in the church, in teaching or such like. So the healing miracle might be used to demonstrate Jesus' power and say something about who he is. So that gives it a context in the preaching of the church. So the form critics thought that the story in that form must have taken shape in its use in the church, in the Christian communities. The other thing they thought they could do was to trace the history of the traditions by the condition, because they thought that the gospel stories must have originated in pure form. So when someone first used a healing miracle story to preach about Jesus, it had, as it were, it was a perfect example of that form. And over the years, the forms get mixed and muddled and added to, and so many of the cases we got in the Gospels are actually the forms in developed state, in having developed, as it were, beyond their first condition. So they thought they could trace this tradition history of how the traditions developed, and they thought the Gospels therefore must be at a certain fairly late stage in the development of these forms. The other thing I'd say about this is that hardly anybody now believes that the forms worked like that.
Okay.
They got it wrong.
Okay, here's a perfect example where I'm going to slow down for you. There are various ways to study the Bible, and we call them criticisms. And one of the most, I'm going to talk about three of them right here very briefly, and these are massive subjects. Form criticism is an English translation of the German word Formgeschichte, and more like histories of forms. And German biblical scholars, after the First World War, so this is very old, they developed this particularly to use for the Old Testament, particularly. So they first looked at the Old Testament to just divide various parts of the Bible. And that's Old Testament narratives, Jewish and Hellenistic literature, a bunch of different. But anyway, as it applies to the Bible, it really started in the Old Testament. Hermann Gunkel, Gunkel, he lived in about 1862 to 1932. He classified the Psalms. And so they looked at history, legends, myths, poetry, psalms. They broke up the different sayings of the Bible into various forms. It eventually got applied to the New Testament and oral tradition there. In New Testament in America, a guy named H.J. Cadbury was well known, and then in British, Lightfoot and Taylor, and then some others, and eventually a guy named Bultmann. Bultmann was a massive figure. Now Bultmann was, there's I'll do a podcast on Bultmann was a massive, massive player in New Testament theology. Form critics argued that if you looked at the various forms of the gospel, let's say the Gospel of Mark, you have a form called the parable. You have various little anecdotal sayings called kreia. It's a old Greco-Roman statement. It's just an anecdote. And you looked at the pronouncement stories, controversy stories. You divide up, you classify all the ways Jesus spoke. And they would argue, the form critics, that the Gospels we have, let's just stick with Mark's Gospel again. In Mark's Gospel we have, it seems to be somewhat thrown together, the first part. Now the Passion narrative is different, but before the Passion narrative, we have almost like a string of pearls, different sayings somewhat strewn together. He's going place to place in a hurry. It's not always chronological, it's not always geographically related. And the form critics said, see, look at there. When you look at these different forms of the sayings, these different forms, these forms actually don't go back to, or most of them, or portions of them, don't go back to Jesus. They are actually put in these forms, here's the key, they're put into these forms of parable and controversy story and whatever, because it's useful for the early church. It's useful for the early church that way. So, for example, in Mark's Gospel, when Jesus is approached by the religious leadership, and they say, you need to make sure your disciples aren't washing their hands, and they're not fasting like John the Baptizer's disciples do, and so forth. So they're fussing at Jesus. We call this a controversy story. The form critic would say that might not have really happened with Jesus, but it certainly was happening in the early church. And so they wrote this form, this story, whatever goes back to Jesus. They turned it into a controversy story to help defend them and encourage them when other fellow Jews were attacking their non-purity. So it took the form it did because the early church leaders put it in that form to encourage or challenge their congregation, like a pastor would, you might say. And then the form critic said, well, we can trace back the history of these different forms. And that's what Bauckham was saying, is that, well, some of these forms really seem to be pure and unadulterated. That is, the gospel writers didn't mess with them. And so these go back to Jesus himself. If you can find the pure forms, then you have the oldest level of oral tradition. And so then what they surmise is that there's a long process of oral traditioning. And the more it looks messed with by a gospel writer, the later it is in the tradition. If it looks like it's not messed with by the gospel writers, that means they're just carrying down an old tradition. And form criticism was it was the thing to do for a very long time. But the last several decades, and maybe a little more, it's fallen on really, really hard times. Most people don't follow form criticism anymore, not in British scholarship and American scholarship for sure. Some people might still do it, but in general, the certainty they had and so forth, it's just not compelling to people anymore like it used to be. The two other major criticisms that they mention, well, one they do for sure, I think later on, but just to say real quickly, there's something else called source criticism, and that's where scholars try to determine what the original source of the material came from. The source, for example, in Mark's gospel, he has a passion narrative that seems quite different from the first part of his gospel. Well, some say, well, there must have been an early source that was passed down, either oral tradition source or a written source. You might say, well, if Mark came from Peter, that's the church tradition, then that's the source. If you had there's a long story. In John's gospel, some say there's a source behind his gospel called the signs material and so forth. That's a different source material. Source criticism is trying to figure out where that came from. It's a little different from form criticism. That's trying to figure out the ways the stories were told in the form in the early church. Source criticism is trying to figure out where the information came from in the first place. Something else is called redaction criticism, and I'll stop on this one. Redaction criticism is a criticism of the redaction or redactor. If you don't like the word redactor, put in the word editor. And redaction criticism focused on the theological aims, you might say, of the various gospel writers. So that's to say, you look at Luke's portrayal of Jesus. I did a podcast called, I don't know what it's called now. What does it mean to say Matthew's Jesus? And I talked the distinction of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I did a podcast on how they presented Jesus in different portrayals. Well, I didn't say this in the podcast, but what I was presenting was redaction criticism. Kind of, sort of. I really was just giving the differences. A redaction critic would really emphasize how these gospel writers are deliberately shaping the material to fit their theological agenda. Now, I think the gospel writers did do that in general. I think they did. That's redaction criticism, focusing on how the authors or the editors, or the redactors of the Gospels, they put all that material together and said, well, I have a point I want to make. And so John presents Jesus as a roaring lion, you might say, and Mark, he's the suffering servant and so forth. Well, anyway, so form criticism is all about that. Now, since it's fallen on hard times, Richard Bauckham is trying to push Bart Ehrman and say, Bart, if you don't believe in form criticism, but Richard Bauckham thinks Bart Ehrman is assuming form criticism is true. So Richard Bauckham is saying, well, then how do you explain it? If you're not believing in form criticism, talk to me. How did the oral tradition actually take time? Because that's Bart Ehrman's major point, is that it took a long time for the oral tradition to get formed, and that's why we can't trust it. It took decades and decades and decades and decades, but that seems to assume form criticism is true. And Richard Bauckham is saying, well, no one really believes that anymore, so you need to defend yourself. I hope that helps.
That's all very interesting. And I guess I'd say several things. One thing is, I think Richard's right that nobody really agrees with the form critics anymore. And so disagreeing with them has really no bearing on my book, because I talk about the form critics and I explain why I don't think they were right either. I don't think that there was a long period of oral tradition because the form critics said so. I think that that's just kind of obviously the case, that stories about Jesus are in wide circulation among his followers for 40 or 60 years before the Gospels were written, and the vast majority of people telling those stories were not there with Jesus. The vast majority of them aren't living even in Palestine. The vast majority of them are living in other cities throughout the Roman Empire. Christian churches are being established throughout the empire, and people are converting. They're converting when they hear stories of Jesus, and then they tell stories of Jesus to others in order to convert them, who tell stories to others to convert them, who tell stories to others to convert them. That goes on for 40, 50, 60 years before the stories get written down. And so that isn't predicated on any of the findings of the famous form critic from the 1920s.
If I were to go and I want to write down what happened in 9/11, and I would have traveled to New York, and I wrote down a narrative of what occurred, I could gather together the stories as they had been told over and over and over, let's say in my church, about what happened, and I just write up a document. That's one option. And that's what Richard Bauckham is saying. If you think of it that way, then the narrative I wrote is just a product of how the oral tradition had gotten to me. That is, I just received it and wrote it down. So if it had been changed, if it had been broken up to segments, if it had been nuanced differently, I don't care about all that stuff. All I care about is writing down as I understand it. I just wrote it down. That would be the product of the way it's been used in my church, those stories. The second way of thinking about how the Gospels got written down is that I would not do that way. I would do it somewhat like that, but then I would actually go interview more people who actually were there in 9/11. And so I would take the information my church has said, but then I would go line up interviews and say, okay, where were you? What happened? Then what happened? Then what happened? I would do my best to consult with the eyewitnesses or people who knew the eyewitnesses. So someone who was there, but it's their sister. Yeah, my brother told me all about it. He went here, 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 here. Here's what happened. So there are two different ways of understanding how the Gospels got written down. Now, there are different ways, but these are two major views here. And Richard Bauckham is saying, Richard believes in the second option, that the Gospel writers didn't just take the information and write it down into a narrative. They actually did some research, like a reporter at a newspaper would go try to talk to original sources. And Richard Bauckham is asking, Bart, which one do you see it as?
And is it your view that Bart does essentially buy into a form of the Gospels being a result of this oral tradition as such?
Yes, I think he does.
And you would differentiate that from what you call oral history?
Yes, oral history. I mean, I use that term because it means, in modern usage, it's actually a distinction Van Siener, in his book on oral tradition, which Bart has used in the book, propounds between oral history, oral tradition, which takes place over several generations. Oral history is recording things within living memory. So it's basically the kind of thing that modern oral historians do, but it's also the way the ancients thought good history should be written. You have to write history within memory, within living memory, so that you can actually talk to people who witnessed the events. That's how you write history. That's what I mean by oral history. Now, can I just the earliest gospel, and I think we're completely agreed, is Mark's gospel. My view of Mark's gospel, as I've argued it in the book, of course, is a very traditional one. That Mark's gospel is a version of Peter's way of telling the stories about Jesus. Peter's version of the gospel traditions, recorded and creatively adapted, of course, by the evangelist Mark. There's nothing chronologically improbable about that. Peter, we know, died in the year 65. He died a violent death in Rome in the year 65, and I think that Mark probably wrote his gospel very soon after that. So I'm not differing from the general view of the date of Mark's gospel, but we only have two tradents of the traditions, if you like. We have Peter himself, and we have Mark the evangelist. And I do not see anything about Mark's gospel that makes that view implausible.
And so what you're setting up here is the difference between what you see as the oral history being used in Mark's gospel, which is the eyewitness testimony, let's say, of Peter, against others who would say that Mark is writing down a sort of a more developed over generations type of stories that were handed down in some way, but not in such a direct fashion.
Yes, I mean, the general view, which I think Bart puts very well, is that these stories passed from mouth to ear to mouth many, many times.
A Chinese whispers effect,
yes,
in effect.
Yes.
But is that a fair characterisation of what you see the Gospel of Mark as being?
Okay, I do want to pause there. I want to make sure you get this, because this is at the core of the whole argument. Let's imagine for a second that the Gospel of Mark was written around AD 70. Now, we don't know when Mark was written. We just don't know. In fact, I think it was quite earlier for various reasons, but I'll spare that for another podcast, I guess, for another point later on in this podcast in my commentary. But most New Testament scholars around the world think that Mark was written probably no later than AD 70. So let's assume it just for the sake of argument. Almost everybody believes that Jesus died around AD 30. So that's 40 years have transpired. 40 years have transpired since Jesus' death and resurrection and the first gospel, which was probably Mark, being written down. So let's imagine for 40 years, what happened during 40 years? For those 40 years, what happened? Bart Ehrman is saying what happened was people told stories about Jesus and told stories about Jesus and it just spread and spread and spread for 40 years. And by the time the Gospel of Mark was written, he did not go consult eyewitnesses. He simply wrote down what he had received after 40 years of telling these stories, and he heard it 40 years later. He goes, oh, I'm going to write down a story. Richard Bauckham is saying that's not what happened. It's not what happened. 40 years after the fact, he didn't just write down what he heard. He actually went and consulted the sources himself. So let's use a modern analogy so we can get our mind around this. 40 years ago this year, in April of 1976, the Apple company was formed. So Steve Jobs and what's-his-name started the Apple company 40 years ago. So let's assume for a second you're working at Apple And you hear all kinds of tales and stories about how it all began 40 years ago. Not 400 years ago, not 4,000 years ago, but 40 years ago. So just let that sink in. 40 years ago. So people who started the company, Steve Jobs still lives, and the people who live they're still around. Now maybe Steve Jobs' grandparents don't live anymore, who knows? But people who are there in the company, they're still around. You work for Apple Company, and you decide to write a tale of what happened way back 40 years ago, how it all started, the first year of maybe the origin of the Apple Company, maybe a little background, and you want to talk about the formation of the Apple Company. Do you write your story based on what you've heard because you've worked at Apple for a long time? And you just say, all right, I know enough. I've heard stories about how it happened. I just sit down and write my narrative, and then I publish it and go, how Apple started. Or do you go consult people who were actually there in the very, very beginning? Or do you consult people who worked with people who were there in the very, very beginning? And then you compile your stories together and then write your narrative. That's exactly what the distinction is of the Gospels themselves. When we talk about oral history and how the Gospels were composed, you kind of sort of have to choose between these two major options. Now, you can be a blend of both, or they might just be all make-believe. But the fact is, if you think the Gospels have any historical truth to them, verisimilitude, when that's what Richard Bauckham believes, then the question is, what happened behind the Gospels before it was written down? So, Bart Ehrman believes that what happened was stories were told and told and told and told and told for 40 years, and that whoever wrote down the story of, let's say, Mark's Gospel did not go consult the original eyewitnesses or people who worked with the eyewitnesses. He was far removed in a distant land. And so my analogy would say today, we would say, if I wrote a story and didn't consult anybody who really worked at Apple, anybody, no one who worked there at all, I'm just simply going to write down things I heard, not second and third hand, but 40 years removed hand from a distant land, and that I was not there to interview anybody at all. That's the distinction between what Richard Bauckham and Bart Ehrman is saying. So let's see what Bart says.
I certainly don't think that Mark was written by the disciple Mark, who was an Aramaic-speaking Jew in Palestine. The Gospel of Mark is written by somebody who's a highly educated Greek-speaking Christian 40 years after the events. Mark doesn't say anything about being based on eyewitnesses. It doesn't say anything about being based on the testimony of Peter. It's not written in the language that Peter spoke. It's not written in the language that Mark spoke. And so I think, Richard's right. I mean, his view is a very traditional view. It's the view that was in circulation for a very long time. But it doesn't seem to be a view that's very plausible given what we know about Mark's Gospel. What we have in Mark's Gospel is a collection of stories that appear to have been in circulation by word of mouth for many decades before Mark even heard about them. And so I think you have to take seriously the linguistic features of Mark, which is that it's a highly literate Greek account written by a highly literate Greek speaker who's not living in Palestine.
Okay, it might seem like Bart Ehrman has changed the subject. Bauckham asked the question, are the Gospels the product of a long oral history of 40 years, or did he consult the sources? And Bart Ehrman brings up Mark himself. So to use my analogy back to the Apple Company, Bart Ehrman is making the argument that if I wrote a narrative about the origin of the Apple Company with Steve Jobs, it's much more akin to someone speaking Spanish. Let's say I now live in Mexico, and I speak Spanish, and I never worked at the Apple Company, and I probably have never even been to the Apple Company, any headquarters anywhere, any base, any company, any store ever, and I'm far removed, speaking a different language, writing about the Apple Company. Richard Bauckham and the traditional view is that that's not a good analogy, that in fact, using the same analogy, that in fact it's much more akin to working at the Apple Company and having immediate access to people who also worked at the Apple Company. So this next part of the discussion is going to be about whether or not the author was even nearby the events geographically or could even write such a narrative. Would he even have access to the oral tradition of the eyewitnesses?
But let's suppose that the author of Mark's Gospel is the John Mark of the New Testament. He comes from Jerusalem. He comes from a wealthy family in Jerusalem. He would have had a Greek education. Mark's Greek is very simple and basic. It's the Greek of someone for whom Greek was not his native language. I would say many scholars would agree with that. You know, this is an Aramaic speaker who can speak Greek, but he's not. He's an educated, intelligent person, but he doesn't have a literary education in good Greek. He writes very simple Greek, very skillfully. But even supposing it's not Mark of Jerusalem, whoever it was who could write such a gospel, there's no implausibility whatever in him having got his traditions straight from Peter, who was alive until the year 65.
Yeah, so I disagree with that. One thing that we need to take into account, two things we need to take into account. One is that we have no reliable information about who John Mark may have been. He shows up in the book of Acts, and he does live in Jerusalem, but we don't have any independent verification of any information about this person. But let's suppose he is a Jerusalem-dwelling Jew in the first century. So one question to ask is, how many people in the first century in Palestine could speak Greek, and how many of them could write Greek in any way? So there have been studies of literacy in Palestine in the first century. Richard knows these studies as well as I do. The best study is by Catherine Hetzer, who shows that probably around 3% of the population of Palestine could read and write. So maybe 3% of the population was literate. But most of those people who can read and write can't read and write in Greek. One should ask, how many authors from Palestine do we know of from the first century who could write in Greek? Well, there's two from the entire first century, and they are these are very upper class Jewish aristocrats. And so was Mark one of those? Probably not. I mean, we don't know, but we don't know anything about him. And
okay, Jewish Literacy in Roman Palestine is the name of the book, Jewish Literacy in Roman Palestine by Catherine Hetzer. And that's the author, the professor of whom he speaks. And that's when she makes the estimate of how many people can read and write in the Roman Palestine at the time. Let me say two quick things about what Bart has just said, because this matters later on. One is, just because we don't have any more evidence that not many Jews wrote in Greek does not therefore mean Jews could not write in Greek. And Bart does this a lot. I'm not sure why he does, but he takes a lack of evidence as evidence that something didn't exist. In other words, he takes an absence and then fills in the gap with therefore it didn't happen. I don't find that compelling. He might be right that many people could not write in Greek except for the highly aristocratic. We just don't know that. We have an enormous amount of literature that is spoken of in the texts that we don't possess. Let me say that a different way. There's an enormous amount of literature we don't have. We know they existed, probably, because it's mentioned in other texts. Even in the New Testament, there's all kinds of documents we don't have. I wish we had it. For example, in 1 Corinthians 5:9, Paul says to the Corinthians, in the first letter I wrote to you. Well, we don't have that first letter. I wish we did, but we don't. Now, this is how it is all through the ancient world. There's all kinds of Jewish, Greek, Roman, Christian literature that is gone. It's gone forever. Now, just because it was mentioned and doesn't exist doesn't mean that's the only literature that exists. There's no telling how much literature existed that people just didn't write about. It was just all kinds of documents. There's all kinds of documents that we didn't know existed until archaeologists discovered them on papyrus scraps. And we go, look at there. There's a brand new gospel, not from the earliest centuries, but there's all kinds of stuff like that. But what Bart Ehrman does is because if we don't have much example of it, therefore it did not happen. That's not compelling. We just don't know enough to know whether or not it was popular or not popular for this literature to exist, because papyrus gets destroyed, it deteriorates, or people have to copy it and buy it or whatever for it to be popular. Maybe it wasn't popular. There's all kinds of reasons why a document could exist for which we don't have evidence anymore. It's not extant. So in just a second, Bart Ehrman's really going to drive into Richard Bauckham and say, how many authors do we know? How many authors do we know? And my response to Bart Ehrman is, that's irrelevant. What we know is what we know. We don't know what we don't know. We don't know how many authors did exist, how much literature was done, how many Jewish authors could actually write or read in Greek. They just didn't do it. So he's making an argument based on silence that I don't find compelling, but I understand what he's saying. The second thing is, Barth does this a good bit too. He says, was John Mark, an aristocrat? And then he laughs. Well, we don't know. Probably not, but we don't know anything about him. Now listen to that. Probably not, but we don't know anything about him. If you don't know anything about him, then you can't say probably not. You know Bob Smith in Oklahoma. Is he rich? Well, probably not. We don't know anything about him. Well, that's silly. You don't know Bob Smith. You just don't know. The point is, if you don't know, it's better to be agnostic and say, we don't have a clue. But Barth doesn't do that. He tends to say, because we don't know, therefore it probably is not true. And I find that constantly in his literature and in his talks, that if we don't know something, it probably is not the case. And I'm just saying, personally, I don't find that compelling. Though I'm not saying I'm hook, line, and sinker believe in everything. I'm just saying, logically, it does not work that because we're ignorant about something, it means therefore it's probable that something is not the case. That just doesn't logically follow. But let's see what happens here.
In order to assume that Mark could write a gospel like this, you'd have to presuppose that he was one of the very upper crust aristocrats in Palestine, and we simply have no evidence that that was the case.
I mean, we'll let Richard respond to that. What about the other contention of Richard, though, is that whoever wrote it, it's perfectly within the timeline for it to have been passed directly, to be from the accounts of Peter, essentially. It's his eyewitness testimony recorded by someone.
Yeah, no, but it could have been an account given to him by Judas Iscariot, or an account given to him by John, or account given by Barnabas, or account given by any of the thousands of people who lived in Palestine, but he wasn't in Palestine. He's living outside of Palestine, and so where did he hear his stories? He almost certainly didn't make a trip to Palestine in order to interview an eyewitness. If he did do that, it's surprising that he didn't say that he did that, because that would have helped verify his account if he had said that I've actually gotten this from an eyewitness, but he says nothing of the sort.
Well, a couple of things to respond there. Firstly, the identity of this writer, but also why you think it is plausible, Richard, that these are actually the recorded testimony of Peter.
Can we just go back? I mean, I don't want to get into a long discussion of literacy in Palestine. I think Catherine Hetzer's estimate is probably too low, and there's a good deal of discussion about this. But if we're talking about Jerusalem, we must remember that a large number of Jews living in Jerusalem came from the diaspora. And according to the New Testament, if we take this to be the John Mark of the New Testament, Mark was related to Barnabas, who had estates in Cyprus that he sold. He came from Cyprus. So the Jerusalem community would include a considerable number of people for whom Greek was actually their native language, because they came from Greek-speaking areas of the diaspora. And as you say, elite Jewish citizens, and again, the Book of Acts portrays Mark's mother as having a big house in Jerusalem. They were a wealthy family. He would have had a good Greek education, as, for example, Josephus did.
Can I just ask you a question about that, Richard?
Yeah.
Between the year 1 and the year 65, how many Greek-speaking authors do we know of from Jerusalem?
How many authors from Jerusalem do we know of at all?
Exactly. And how many wrote in Greek?
Well, I'm saying we have very few Jewish authors from that period.
We don't have it, right. And we don't have any that wrote in Greek.
We don't have any who wrote in Hebrew either.
That's why I don't think that they wrote. I mean, these were not people who were writing. These were people who were illiterate.
The majority of Jewish, the majority of Palestinian Jews were illiterate, or maybe they could just write their name or some basic thing. I quite agree. And once again, I think we've got to stress that both Mark's Gospel and John's Gospel are written in very simple, straightforward Greek, far below the literary level of Josephus.
Hey, let me say very briefly right there that there are various styles or modes of writing. Think of English. You can write a text, you can write an email, you might go up in formal degree. I'm trying to go up in formal degree, so text is usually very simple. You is just with the letter U. You going to store, or you go up to email, and you might go up to formal email, and then a letter and a formal letter, and then there's all kinds of documents, and then you might have, or newspapers. The Wall Street Journal is written at a level that's different from, I don't know, E-News or whatever the local pop culture gossip stuff is. So the reading level is very different. Well, in the ancient world, and probably in every language, but certainly in the ancient world in Greek, it's the same way. They could write very, very simply or very complex. And the erudite, the scholarly, wrote at a level that the modern person back then, the average person, couldn't write and couldn't even read it. Most scholars, based on studies, there's reasons to think this, particularly on inscriptions and other literature we have, that the average Jew who worked particularly in sales probably had some basic, like Richard Bauckham is saying, some basic understanding of Greek, and maybe some basic understanding of Latin. It doesn't mean they could read and write much of it, but probably some basic, read little. And that's why they use the word illiterate. That is, they don't have formal training. When you read the New Testament documents, this comes out as well. And anybody who knows that you go to Greek 101, your first year of introduction to Greek, particularly biblical Koine Greek, you start out with the babies. And the easiest Greek in the New Testament typically is understood to be from John's Gospel. John, or the epistles of John. And Mark's Gospel is the easiest of the Gospels the second easiest. So John's Gospel is very easy to read, and then Mark's Gospel is right above there. Then you probably above that is Matthew, and the toughest one is Luke. Luke and Acts is written in much more difficult Greek. Then you have documents like Hebrews and 1st, 2nd Peter. Some of these are very complex Greek they're difficult to read without a really good lexicon, a good grasp of Greek language. So that's what Richard Bauckham is saying, is when you look at Mark's Gospel and John's Gospel, and John's Gospel, the two people he thinks actually come from the area, that it is not unlikely that they in fact composed the documents, because the Greek they speak is simple. It is, by the way, it is simple. Everybody, and Bart knows that too. He knows it is simple Greek, but he's making a different argument. Remember, the whole point of all this is trying to argue, back to my Apple analogy, if I wrote a story about Apple, was I there? Could I speak English language and interview people who worked at the Apple company? Could I interview Steve Jobs? Or am I from Mexico and speak Spanish and can't interview anybody? So right now, Bauckham is arguing that John Mark was close enough and could translate into Greek enough to interview the eyewitness testimony, the eyewitness sources. Bart Ehrman is saying, nope, could not have happened. John Mark, or probably did not happen. John Mark had to have been very, very educated and aristocratic, and he and John apparently are the only examples in the time period of Jews who wrote in Greek. And for Bart Ehrman, apparently that can't happen. And one could just say in response to Bart Ehrman, well, these are the two examples. That is, so Bart Ehrman says, we have no examples. Richard Bauckham is saying, well, we do. We have two, the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of John.
I do think that Mark is an author. Whoever he was, he's an author. He has a creative role in his writing. I'm not wishing to downplay the contribution of Mark as the author of his Gospel. But I'm saying that the idea that the sources from which he got the stories and sayings of Jesus were primarily from Peter himself is entirely plausible, and there's nothing about the Gospel that refutes that. Now, why do I think positively that these traditions do come from Peter? It comes from actually putting together two sides of an argument. One is looking at the evidence of the Gospel itself, and the other is looking at the evidence of a man called Papias, who was writing at the beginning of the 2nd century, and who, as it happens, we only sadly... One thing I do agree with Bart about is, if we could wish for some ancient Christian literature to be restored, Papias, it's a great tragedy that we don't have Papias, because he could have told us all kinds of interesting things. But anyway, we do have two fragments of what he said about the Gospels, and they are the earliest statements about the Gospels outside the New Testament itself. And so very interesting, and they've been pored over by scholars for centuries, and all kinds of things have been said about them. Just briefly, what Papias says about Mark's Gospel is that Mark was Peter's interpreter or translator. and he wrote down the sayings and stories about Jesus as he heard them from Peter.
There are a lot of documents, like I said earlier, that we don't have anymore that are referenced in works that we do have, and that's a shame because, boy, it'd be nice to get our hands on some of these ancient texts. And there is a man named Papias of Hierapolis, and Hierapolis is in modern Turkey. He was a bishop of the area, and most scholars think he lived around 70 to 160, so basically right around the turn of the first century. And the story is that he knew John the Elder. You know, John the Elder of the epistles, the 1, 2, 3 John, and probably the John the Elder who composed or edited the Gospel of John, but that's a different story. Well, Papias apparently wrote 5 different books about the sayings of Jesus. Now, exactly what he wrote is debated. Is it something like a gospel, or is it something like an exposition or explanation or commentary on the Gospels? And it's difficult to tell, and that's debated. But apparently he wrote 5 volumes. We don't have any of those volumes. Man, that would have been, that'd be so great, because he is an early source. The only thing we know about Papias comes from 2 authors, a guy named Irenaeus of Lyon. Irenaeus was around 180, and so that's about 100 years after Papias lived. And then Eusebius of Caesarea. There's various Eusebiuses that are important in the church, but Eusebius of Caesarea wrote several documents, and he wrote something that's translated from the Latin as church history. Now, Eusebius lived around the year 300, so that's a lot longer. So that's 200 years after Papias. But Eusebius writes all kinds of stuff about what happened in the early church, because it is called a church history. Now, scholars all debate all the time about how much we can trust Eusebius about what he says, but nevertheless, a lot of what most people traditionally believe about what happened to the apostles, what happened in the early church for the first few centuries, a lot of it comes from Eusebius. He's not our only author, but he's a biggie. Eusebius talks about Papias, and he talks about these 5 books that no longer exist for us. They're not extant. And he actually gives, apparently, some block quotes from Papias. Some actual quotes from the documents that Papias wrote. Okay, so I'm going to say this one more time. Eusebius, the church historian, around 300, quotes from a guy named Papias from documents that we no longer have. And Papias says things that are really important in scholarship about understanding the origin of the earliest Christian movement. Well, Papias says some things about the authorship of the Gospels. So here's a typical translation of a segment from one of the scraps of Papias. This is from Eusebius. Okay, this is what Eusebius says that Papias says. So here's what he says. Quote, Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, you might say translator too, but Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately whatsoever he remembered. It was not, however, in exact order that he related the sayings or deeds of Christ. For he neither heard the Lord nor accompanied him. But afterwards, as I said, he accompanied Peter, who accommodated his instructions to the necessities of his hearers, but with no especial care not to omit anything he had heard, and not to put anything fictitious into the statements. Now later on he talks about Matthew. Papias says Matthew put together the oracles or the sayings of the Lord in the Hebrew language, and each one interpreted them as best he could. End quote. Now, that's also problematic when it comes to the Hebrew language, because we don't know if he means Aramaic or Hebrew, and that's a long story. But that's what's going on here right now, because what's about to happen is Richard Bauckham is making the argument that Eusebius says, Papias says, that John Mark wrote his gospel being well informed by Peter himself, Peter the apostle. What Bart Ehrman is about to do is say, basically, there's no reason to think that's true. So Richard Bauckham is going to make 2 arguments that John Mark is the John Mark in Acts, the book of Acts, who's cousins with Barnabas. That John Mark is the same Mark who wrote the gospel. He has 2 arguments. One I just mentioned, and that is from what Eusebius says about Papias. The other argument Richard Bauckham makes is that if you assume Peter is the main source of the gospel, we call that Petrine source, Petrine for Peter. If you assume it, Richard Bauckham says, it makes a whole lot of sense of the data. For example, in the gospel itself, Peter is mentioned more than any other disciple. Peter plays a prominent role. The geography of the Gospel of Mark is close to Peter's home. So there's a lot of things that make sense if Peter is the primary source. So those are Richard Bauckham's top two arguments for why Peter is most likely the original source of John Mark. That John Mark interviewed and interpreted Peter. And that is to say probably interpreted and translated into Greek. One is that Eusebius as Papias says it. Two, because if you assume it, it sure makes sense of the gospel.
I think the reality is that if someone were to read Mark's gospel and have no ideas at all ahead of time where it came from, they would never think that this came from Peter. There's nothing about Mark to make you think it came from Peter.
What about
now,
all of what
Peter's a main figure in the Gospel of Mark,
Mm.
but every narrative has main characters. Nobody would want to argue that the main character in every narrative was the eyewitness who was behind it.
If Mark is, in a general sense, within the category of ancient biography, a biography written within living memory of the subject of the biography, as Mark's Gospel was, people would expect it to be based on eyewitness testimony, and so they'd be looking for the characters in the Gospel who could be the plausible eyewitness source.
I don't know what evidence there would be that somebody reading an account, for example, a biography of Plutarch, that they would think that Plutarch had interviewed eyewitnesses. So I don't know what evidence you're thinking of.
Well, that there is evidence from Plutarch. Of course, Plutarch wrote biographies that stretched over many centuries, very, very ancient ones and near contemporary ones. So it would only apply to those biographies of Plutarch that were written reasonably close to his own time.
What in the world is he talking about? Well, maybe you're not thinking that. Okay, fine. But if you are, let me try to help you. Bart Ehrman is saying, what makes you think, Richard, that writing a biography would compel Mark to go look for the eyewitness testimony? What makes you think that? If you look at people like Plutarch, who wrote various biographies of very important people, he wrote it over a long period of time, and almost all the people he wrote about had been long time dead and gone. And in those sources, he didn't always consult eyewitness testimony. And then Richard Bauckham is saying that's right, because they were long dead and gone. Richard Bauckham is arguing that whenever people wrote biographies about people with a living memory, you did go talk to eyewitness testimonies if you could. You did go do it. So even though Mark's gospel does not say at the very beginning, the following is from eyewitness testimony, like Luke's gospel somewhat does, even though it doesn't say that, Richard Bauckham is arguing or suggesting that Mark's gospel would have done that Mark would have gone and looked for eyewitness testimonies because it was within the living memory of those who knew Jesus. Now, that's it. So that's the issue of date. So if you date it early enough, Bauckham is arguing that there's the assumption, and Bart Ehrman is saying there is no assumption. We should not ever assume that the person went to go look for eyewitness testimony unless the text says it. If the text says it. Richard Bauckham says, well, if you assume Papias is not lying or mistaken, and if you assume that, then you go back and read the Gospel of Mark, you go, boy, it sure pops out. It sure looks like Peter was the background of it. But that's the distinction of date. Now, if you want to know Richard Bauckham's argument for why biographies why would a person in the ancient world assume, as Richard Bauckham says, that they're looking for eyewitness testimony if it's a recent figure? Well, you need to go read Richard Bauckham's book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. He lays out arguments based on ancient examples of why he thinks that Mark would have gone to eyewitness testimony because he's writing a biography of a person who lived not long ago, very, very recently. That is, there are people still around to whom you can go and ask what happened.
it's very often said that the Gospels are anonymous. And, of course, in the sense that the authors are not named within the text of the Gospels, that's perfectly true, they are anonymous. We only have the titles to tell us purported names of the authors. But actually a great deal of ancient literature, Greek and Roman literature, is anonymous in just the same sense. In other words, the authors are not named within the text of the works. We only know who the author is from the titles that have come down to us, but they're titles that were given by scribes or librarians or whatever. So in a sense it's true that the Gospels are anonymous, but it doesn't mean that they were intended to circulate without names.
Okay, just to make sure you understand the point he's making, the Gospels themselves do not say who wrote the Gospels. Luke is the only possible exception, of course. But Mark and Matthew and John, let's leave Luke out of it. Mark, Matthew, and John do not say, for example, Mark's Gospel, I am Mark, I'm John Mark, my cousin's Barnabas. You read about me in the book of Acts. That's not what happens. So they are anonymous. Inside of the document, we don't have any evidence of who wrote the document. What we have are titles. The titles were not in the document, they were given to the document. What scholars debate, like right here, and you're about to hear more of it, they debate on when the Gospels got their titles. Did Mark write the Gospel and at the top of it write, this is my Gospel, my name is John Mark? And we don't have that anymore because no manuscript evidence has that. But it might have happened. We just don't have it anymore. But if it did not happen, who gave it a title? When did they give it a title? Richard Bauckham is saying in the ancient world, many ancient texts are anonymous in that in the document it doesn't say, my name is Hercules, I wrote this document. But they were given titles very early on to distinguish between other works. And Bauckham is arguing that it's not crazy at all to think that in the earliest church, they gave titles to the documents very early on because as soon as another gospel circulated outside of Mark's gospel, the church had to separate it somehow. Somehow they had to separate it and say, which gospel are you reading from? Is that Mark's gospel, Matthew's gospel, or is it gospel 1, 2, 3, 4? And so if Richard is saying that the gospel titles probably came early on. This is really famously argued by Martin Hengel, a scholar of the previous generation, and he's written a lot of really good books. But he's still influential today. But he argues some similar points. So let's see what Bart Ehrman has to say about this. So Richard Bauckham's arguing, yes, they're anonymous, but we have every reason to think it's historically probable that titles were given very early on, because they had to distinguish between Mark's gospel and other gospels. Bart Ehrman thinks that the titles of the gospels were not written early or discovered early or put on them early in the first century. They were added in the second century. And he's going to tell you why. So he thinks the titles come much later than when most scholars do think that.
When you have the early quotations of these Gospels, nobody identifies them as connected with anybody. And so, for example, you start getting quotations, they appear to be from the Gospels in the early second century with authors such as, at the end of the first century, First Clement quotes Gospels, Ignatius quotes Gospels, Polycarp quotes Gospels, Justin quotes Gospels. None of these they'll quote sayings, but they'll never say this. This is from the Gospel of Mark or this is the Gospel of Matthew. They never do that, and Papias doesn't do that either. And so it's very strange when you get down to Justin Martyr around the year 150 or so. Justin will refer to what appear to be our Gospels, but he doesn't call them by our Gospels. He calls them the memoirs. And in fact, the only memoir that he names is the memoir of Peter. He's talking about the Gospel of Peter. It's not until you get to Irenaeus in the year 180 or 185 that you have any author saying that the Gospels are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. This is the first time that we know that our Gospels go by this name.
Well, they're writing for Christian readers who are familiar with the Gospels they're referring to. It's like Jews referring to the law of Moses. They don't tell us it's in Genesis. They tell us it's what Moses said. It's inconceivable that they didn't call them anything. Did they call them Gospel 1, Gospel 2, Gospel 3? What did they call them?
Okay, let me say a few things, because there actually is a pause there on the program, and he comes back and sort of kind of changes the subject. First of all, there are supposed allusions and quotes from the early, what we call apostolic fathers. These are Christian thinkers who wrote documents and letters and apocalypses and so forth after the close of what we call the New Testament. See, Christians didn't stop writing books. They kept writing them and kept writing them over and over and over. And you can read these. Almost all of them have been translated to English. You can read them. You can go online and read them. You can buy the books and read them. And you can see what the Christians continue to write and think about. In these documents, we have what seem to be, again, quotes or allusions to the Gospels. But technically speaking, these are not quotes from a Gospel. They are sayings that later on show up in a Gospel. It's just that we assume, most scholars assume, that these sayings are quoting from a Gospel. But again, that's debated. They could be just quotes from oral tradition. The fact is, we don't know exactly when the Gospels are written, and that's a long podcast there. But most people think these are quotes from a book. But again, they might not be. They might just be quotes from oral sources that's traveling around the churches. And from the Gospels and from Paul's letters. But let's assume for a second they are, in fact, quotes from the Gospels. Then the issue is, well, when they quote from the document, they don't say, and this is from Matthew, this is from Mark. Bart Ehrman says, if the Gospels were called something, why didn't these early church fathers say, this is from the book of so-and-so? Richard Bauckham is saying, because the sayings they quote are almost entirely from Jesus. So Jesus is the authority. The point is not to make a distinction, say, okay, here's John's Jesus, here's Matthew Jesus. It's Jesus. And since it's a quote from Jesus, they don't feel a need to cite the source. Much like in the Old Testament is the book of Moses, or they'll just start quoting things. But they don't have to say all the time the exact reference, because if they think it comes from Moses, that's authoritative enough. So you get to make up your mind on that, don't you? The other thing is, the earliest extant or existing reference to the Gospels being called Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, like Bart Ehrman says, is from about 180 and 185. He's exactly right. But again, what I don't find compelling is where Bart says, since that's the first time it appears, therefore they were never called anything. I don't find that compelling at all. It just doesn't follow that just because the first reference we have in literature comes from 180 doesn't mean no one in the early church called the Gospels by a name. That's completely uncompelling. They could have been called all kinds of things and just not written down. We don't know. But again, as usual, Bart doesn't stay with, we don't know. He states with, we don't know, therefore they traveled anonymously. And they never had a name until Irenaeus said so. So what Richard Bauckham is he was upset about, is saying, Bart, come on. If these documents all traveled in the early church, they had to call them something. If I said, hey, church over in Ephesus, can I borrow a copy of a gospel? And they said, which gospel do you want? And they said, they don't have names. Just give me one. That means, that's Richard Bauckham saying, this is inconceivable. They would have said, give me the one according to blank, the one who wrote it. And if they copy these documents, as both Bart and Richard, all New Testament scholars agree, they copied them. Well, how do they copy them? What do they ask for? If they quoted it in worship or at church, what do they quote? What do they cite? And so for Richard and for most New Testament scholars, it is inconceivable that the documents genuinely travel with no title whatsoever. Now, maybe the titles are all wrong. And it's not Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's Donald Trump, Hillary, Donald Duck, and Batman. Maybe the titles are completely wrong. But what Richard Bauckham is saying, it's inconceivable. They didn't have some kind of title, some kind of distinguishing mark. But Bart Ehrman says that's exactly what happened. Bart Ehrman says they had no distinguishing mark, no title, nothing. All the Gospels were completely anonymous, just randomly floating documents that the early church used that had zero title whatsoever.
Let me make 2 points. One, just in direct response to that, I don't think that that there's really good evidence that these books were written by anybody living in Palestine. It's true that some of the upper crust elite in Palestine could speak Greek, but the reality is we don't have any Christian authors we don't have any authors. We don't have any Jewish authors in this time period who are writing Greek in Palestine. By the time when Mark's Gospel is written, the only author we have is a Jewish author living in Rome. Who wrote in Greek, and so that seems unlikely. Can I just take a second, though, to explain how I see this thing?
Go ahead.
The early church fathers who quote these Gospels don't say anything about them being Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. What's happening in the early church in the 2nd century is that there are a lot of Gospels floating around. There's a Gospel allegedly written by Peter, one allegedly written by Thomas, one allegedly written by Philip, one allegedly written by Judas Iscariot, or about Judas Iscariot, one dealing with Mary Magdalene. They're all called these things: the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Peter. And Christians in the proto-Orthodox churches, the churches that are supporting the views that later became the dominant views within Christianity, are using a range of Gospels themselves, but they're anonymous. And so by the time of Irenaeus, he's a heresy hunter. He's trying to weed out the false Gospels. And his Gospels are these Gospels that are being widely used, but they don't have names to them. And so they've got to associate them with names of apostles. And so they pick 2 people, Matthew and John, as 2 of the apostles, and then they want Gospels representing the 2 chief apostles of Rome, Peter and Paul. But everybody knows that Peter and Paul didn't write Gospels, and so they associate Peter with, they say Peter's version was written by Mark, his companion. Paul's version was written by Luke, Paul's companion. And so what they're doing is they're naming these Gospels in order to provide them with apostolic credentials. This doesn't happen until all these other Gospels are floating around, and the early Christians have to say, look, these Gospels we're using are apostolic, and the Gospels you're using are forgeries.
The point that Richard Bauckham is making is to say, okay, Bart Ehrman, Irenaeus does mention Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in about 180. But if Eusebius is accurately recording Papias, Papias is much earlier than Irenaeus, about 100 years, roughly 80 to 100 years. And he specifically mentions Mark and Matthew. So the earliest references to those Gospels could be from Papias. And Bart Ehrman says, well, he got Matthew wrong. But so far, what's interesting to me is, and that's debated, and you can read your literature and figure out whether you think Bart Ehrman is right, because there's all kinds of ways to understand what Papias is saying and the fragment that's recorded in Eusebius. But what's interesting to me is Bart Ehrman does not say anything at all about what Papias says about Mark. Ever. In this whole discussion, he just dismisses it. In other words, if you dismiss what Papias said, well, then it's easy to do that. But if you don't dismiss it, if Papias was right, that John Mark really is the interpreter of Peter, and then later on, we have Irenaeus mention Mark, and it's from the same, it seems to fit the same description, then we have a very, very, very early record that Mark's gospel was written by John Mark, and that Peter is the source. But that's what you have to do, right? If you're trying to dismiss something, what you say is, the references we have don't count. If the references we have don't count, then you have nothing. And if you have nothing, you're agnostic. You say, I don't know. But that's the difference, is Bart Ehrman's trying to suggest that every reference from Papias, Eusebius, all these places, they don't count. If they don't count, then the documents must have been anonymous. And then Richard Bauckham and many other scholars would say, well, we do have things in Papias and other places, and they should not be dismissed. They're actually good. Well, that's all I'm going to say right now. There's a part 2 to the podcast that I encourage you to go listen to, and it speaks a lot about memory, whether or not we can trust memory. So until next time, I'll see you. God bless you. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. I really do hope that you enjoyed it. I hope you'll listen more. If you want more, go to davidpendergrass.com. There are tabs at the top that let you have access to all the podcasts I've recorded, to sermons I've done, books I've written. They're all there at davidpendergrass.com. You can also check me out on Facebook, facebook.com/glimpse of the kingdom. facebook.com/glimpse of the kingdom. And also look at my Twitter feed at Glimpse the Kingdom or at Dr. D. Pendergrass, at Dr. D. Pendergrass. There's tons of ways to reach out. I hope you will. Send me your questions, send me your comments. If you'd like to support the ministries of Glimpse of the Kingdom, you can also find ways to give online on davidpendergrass.com. If you'd like for me to come and do some consulting, check out my website, davidpendergrassconsulting.com, and I'll be happy to come out and speak to your organization and help and train any way I can. God bless you. See you online.